The handcuffs clicked shut so hard that Renata Cole felt the metal bite into her skin. Right there in the hallway she had walked for 30 years. 30 years. That was how long she had worn this same blue scrub top, pushed the same kind of gurney, whispered comfort into the ears of strangers who were scared to die alone. And now she stood frozen under the fluorescent lights of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, while a young sheriff's deputy twisted her arm behind her back like she was some criminal pulled off the street. Renata Cole, you're under arrest for embezzlement and falsifying hospital records. The words hit her like a slap. Around her, patients in wheelchairs stopped rolling. A young mother clutched her toddler tighter. Nurses who had worked beside Renata for a decade stood frozen in the doorway, mouths open, unable to process what they were seeing. There must be a mistake, Renata said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. I have never taken a single dollar that wasn't mine. The deputy, a broad-shouldered man named Cole Bennett, no relation, though the coincidence would later feel almost cruel, sneered down at her like she was already guilty. Save it for the judge, ma'am. He said ma'am, the way some men say it when they mean the opposite of respect. Renata's eyes swept the crowd gathering in the hallway. She recognized every face. The security guard, Andre, who she'd once stayed late to comfort after his mother passed. The pediatric nurse, Yvonne, whose baby Renata had rocked to sleep during 3 overnight shifts when Yvonne couldn't afford daycare. None of them said a word. Fear has a way of silencing even the kindest people when badges and handcuffs are involved. This is wrong, a soft voice finally said. It was Grace Liu, a first-year resident. Officer, she's the most honest person in this building. Deputy Bennett didn't even look at her. Then she has nothing to worry about. As they marched Renata down the hallway, past the nurse's station where she had spent 3 decades saving lives, past the little chapel where she prayed every single shift before clocking in. Something inside her chest cracked open, not from guilt, from the sheer, suffocating unfairness of it. Because Renata Cole was guilty of exactly one thing, and it wasn't embezzlement. It was giving away almost every extra dollar she ever earned, quietly, secretly, to strangers who needed it more than she did. Rent for a single mother 3 floors down from her apartment. Winter coats for a shivering family she saw waiting at a bus stop one December night. And years ago, tuition. Tuition for a boy nobody believed in. A boy everyone had already given up on. She had never told a soul. That was the point of doing good in silence. You didn't need applause, you needed the good itself to exist. But now, as the deputy shoved her into the back of a patrol car outside the hospital doors, in front of the very community she had quietly held together for 3 decades, Renata Cole wondered if her silence was about to cost her everything. The patrol car door slammed. Through the window, she watched Deputy Bennett exchange a look with another man standing near the ambulance bay. A tall sergeant with cold eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Sergeant Holt. She'd seen him before, always lurking near the billing department, always asking too many questions about hospital records that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Something told her this wasn't about missing money at all. Something told her this was about making sure Renata Cole never spoke again, and she had no idea why. Nobody at St. Augustine Memorial ever asked Renata Cole about her past. If they had, they would have learned she grew up in a 2-room house with a mother who cleaned office buildings at 4 in the morning and a father who left before Renata turned 6. She remembered being 12 years old, sitting on the porch steps, watching her mother count coins from a mason jar to pay for a school field trip. She remembered promising herself, in that quiet, fierce way children make promises, that one day she would make sure no child she could help would ever have to feel that shame. She became a nurse not because it was glamorous, but because it was useful. Because pain didn't care about your bank account, and neither did Renata. She worked double shifts through her 20s, raised no family of her own. She used to joke that the hospital was her family, 300 patients a year, all of them her children for however long they needed her. People underestimated her constantly. She was quiet. She wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation. She drove a 14-year-old Corolla with a cracked side mirror she never bothered to fix. Newer nurses sometimes assumed she was just an old-timer coasting toward retirement, someone who'd stopped dreaming decades ago. They had no idea that Renata Cole had, for the last 20 years, quietly redirected nearly a third of every paycheck into a locked file box under her bed labeled, in her careful handwriting, seeds. Seeds because that was how she thought of it. You didn't always see what grew from a seed. Sometimes you planted it and walked away and never knew if it took root. But you planted it anyway because that was the only way anything good ever grew. One of those seeds had a name, Marcus Whitfield. She remembered him only as a scrawny 15-year-old from her old neighborhood, the son of a woman named Delia who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on some months. Marcus was smart. Dangerously smart, the kind of smart that either builds a future or gets exploited by the streets when nobody invests in it. Teachers said he could be somebody. Somebody just needed to believe it first. So Renata quietly paid for his tutoring. Then his uniform for the academic program that could get him into a magnet high school. Then, years later, an anonymous scholarship fund mysteriously appeared to cover his community college tuition. Routed through a local nonprofit so no name would ever be attached. She never told Marcus. She never told his mother. She simply watched, from a distance, as the boy nobody believed in slowly built a life for himself. And then, one day, she stopped hearing anything about him at all. Life moved on. She kept working. She kept planting seeds. She never once wondered if any of them would grow tall enough to shade her one day, because that thought never crossed her mind. She wasn't planting for herself. But now, sitting in the back of a patrol car with her wrists cuffed, Renata Cole couldn't shake a strange, tugging feeling. A feeling that somewhere in this town, something she had planted years ago was still alive. She had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, that very seed would walk into the precinct wearing a badge, and freeze the moment he read her name on an arrest file. By the time the patrol car reached the Wexford County Sheriff's Department, word had already spread through the hospital like wildfire. Sergeant Daniel Holt made sure of that. He'd tipped off a local reporter before Renata even reached the booking desk, feeding a story about a trusted nurse caught stealing from the hospital's supply fund. He wanted her humiliated publicly and quickly, before anyone had time to ask questions. A story dies fastest when it's buried under outrage before facts arrive. Inside the precinct, Renata sat in a cold interrogation room, her wrists finally free of the cuffs but her dignity nowhere in sight. Holt entered with a manila folder and dropped it on the table with a deliberate thud. "We found discrepancies going back 3 years, he said, sliding out a page of falsified numbers. Supply orders, payroll adjustments, all routed through your employee ID. Renata studied the numbers, her stomach twisting. "I've never seen these figures in my life. I don't even have access to payroll systems." Convenient answer. "It's the truth." Holt smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows he's holding all the cards. "The truth is whatever the paperwork says it is." Outside, in the hospital break room, the story was already spinning out of control. A local news segment aired by evening, showing grainy security footage of Renata being led out in cuffs, captioned, "Nurse arrested in hospital theft scheme." Comment sections filled instantly with cruel assumptions from strangers who knew nothing about her. Yvonne, the young nurse whose baby Renata had rocked to sleep on so many exhausted nights, watched the segment with tears in her eyes. "This is not who she is," she whispered to her husband. "Something is very wrong here." But fear kept most of her co-workers quiet. Nobody wanted to be the next person the sergeant decided to target. Holt had a reputation. Cross him, and your schedule got mysteriously difficult. Your parking spot vanished. Your file got flagged for review. Back in the interrogation room, Holt leaned in close, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was somehow more menacing than his shouting would have been. "Sign this confession, Ms. Cole, and we can make this quiet. A quiet retirement. No trial. No headlines. You walk away with your pension." Renata looked up at him, and for the first time, something other than fear entered her eyes. Clarity. "You want me to confess to a crime I didn't commit," she said slowly, "so that whatever you actually did stays buried." Holt's jaw tightened, just barely. It was a small motion in the door and to sign it, but it was enough for Renata to know she'd struck something true. That's a serious accusation for someone in your position, he said coldly. So is arresting an innocent woman in front of 300 witnesses, Renata replied. Holt slammed the folder shut. You have until tomorrow morning to sign. After that, this goes to the DA, and I promise you the story only gets worse from here. He left her alone in that freezing room, the hum of the fluorescent light the only sound. Renata pressed her palms flat against the table to steady the trembling that had finally caught up with her. She had spent 30 years quietly saving other people. Now, for the first time in her life, she had absolutely no idea who, if anyone, was coming to save her. 2 floors above the interrogation rooms, in the records division of the Wexford County Sheriff's Department, a young officer named Marcus Whitfield was pulling an overnight shift reviewing recent case intakes. He almost skipped past the file. Almost. But something made him pause on the name typed across the top. Cole, Renata M. His hands stilled over the keyboard. Couldn't be. Cole was a common enough surname, he told himself. There had to be dozens of Renata Coles in the state. Except when he opened the file and saw her address. The same modest street 2 blocks from where he grew up. His chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. Marcus had never met the woman who paid for his tutoring all those years ago. He'd never known her name. All he knew, growing up, was that a scholarship, from a community fund, mysteriously covered his academic program fees right when his mother was on the verge of pulling him out. He remembered his mother crying at the kitchen table, clutching a letter that said his tuition for the semester was fully paid. No explanation, no name attached, just a stamped receipt from a nonprofit called Wexford Community Futures. He'd spent years wondering who had done that for him. He'd built his entire life chasing the idea of becoming someone who could pay it forward the same anonymous way. It was part of why he became a police officer in the first place. He wanted to protect people the way someone had once quietly protected him. Now, staring at the arrest file of a 61-year-old nurse named Renata Cole, something in his gut told him this was more than coincidence. He pulled the financial records attached to her case. The evidence Sergeant Holt claimed proved embezzlement. Marcus had spent 2 years training in financial crimes before transferring to patrol. He knew what real embezzlement paperwork looked like. Real fraud left a messy trail. Inconsistent formatting, multiple login timestamps, irregular authorization codes. This wasn't messy. This was too clean. Every entry used the exact same font, the exact same formatting template, created within a single afternoon according to the metadata timestamp buried in the document properties. Someone had built this file all at once. Recently, not over 3 years like Holt claimed. Marcus's pulse quickened. He dug further and found something even stranger. A separate folder, half hidden in an old shared drive, labeled Supply Fund Adjustments, Q3. Inside were real financial discrepancies, real missing funds. Except the name attached to every single actual withdrawal wasn't Renata Cole. It was Sergeant Daniel Holt. Marcus sat back in his chair, his heart hammering. Somebody had taken real embezzlement, Holt's own theft, and built a fake paper trail to pin it on an innocent nurse. But why Renata Cole specifically? Why target her? He needed more information, and he needed it fast, because Renata's confession deadline was less than 12 hours away. Marcus reached for his phone to call his supervisor, then froze. What if his supervisor was part of this too? He had no idea how deep this went, or who else might be protecting Holt. He decided there was only one person he could trust completely in this entire building, himself. And one more question burned in his mind, growing louder with every second. Who exactly was this nurse? And why did her name feel like it belonged to a memory he could never quite reach? Marcus spent the next 4 hours doing what good officers are trained to do. Following the paper, not the story someone else was telling him. He cross-referenced Holt's financial withdrawals against hospital audit logs from the past 18 months and found a pattern that made his stomach turn. Nearly $340,000 had been quietly siphoned from the hospital's medical supply and equipment fund through a shell vendor account, Meridian Medical Logistics, which existed only on paper. No warehouse, no employees, just a bank account that received hospital payments and forwarded them to a private account registered under Holt's brother-in-law. For over a year, nobody noticed because Holt had positioned himself as the department's unofficial liaison to hospital billing. A role with no real oversight, built entirely on trust. But 3 months ago, something threatened to expose him. A routine state audit request for supply chain documentation. Holt needed a scapegoat, someone whose access and reputation could plausibly explain the missing funds if anyone dug deeper. Renata Cole was the perfect target. She had decades of hospital access. She kept a low profile. She had no powerful friends, no lawyer on retainer, nothing that would make framing her feel risky. What Holt didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Renata's spotless, 30-year record actually contained the one thing that could unravel everything. An old internal memo she'd filed years earlier, flagging irregular supply orders from a vendor she didn't recognize. At the time, hospital administration dismissed her concerns as a clerical misunderstanding. But the memo still existed, buried in an old departmental archive, with her name and the date stamped clearly at the top. If investigators ever looked closely, that memo would prove Renata had noticed the fraud years before anyone else, meaning she was never the criminal. She was the first whistleblower Holt never managed to silence. Marcus found the memo just before 3 in the morning, his hands shaking as he read it. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a woman who had unknowingly stumbled onto corruption years ago, and was now being erased before she could ever connect the dots. He thought about the scholarship fund again, Wexford Community Futures, and something clicked violently into place. He pulled the nonprofit's old donor records, a dusty digital file barely anyone had accessed in a decade. And there, buried in a spreadsheet of anonymous contributions, was a name tied to a routing account. R. Cole. Marcus stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The woman being framed for embezzlement. The woman sitting in a holding cell right now, hours away from signing a false confession, was the same woman who had quietly paid his tuition when he was a 15-year-old boy with nothing and no one believing in him. His hands trembled as the pieces assembled themselves into a single, undeniable truth. Renata Cole had saved his future once, without ever asking for a single thing in return. And now, without knowing it, she needed saving herself. He grabbed the financial records, the metadata report, the whistleblower memo, and the donor spreadsheet and printed every single page. Whatever happened next, he was not going to let this woman disappear into a false confession on his watch. But as he stood to leave the records room, his badge and folder in hand, he ran straight into his direct supervisor, Lieutenant Voss, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Whitfield," Voss said slowly, eyes flicking to the folder in his hands. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marcus's mind raced. He didn't yet know if Voss was compromised or clean, and one wrong move could bury the evidence and Renata forever. He decided to gamble on honesty. "Sir, I found something in the Cole case that doesn't add up," Marcus said, holding his ground. "The embezzlement file against her was fabricated in a single afternoon. I have proof the Real theft belongs to Sergeant Holt." Voss's expression didn't change immediately, and for one agonizing second, Marcus thought he'd made a fatal mistake. Then the lieutenant exhaled sharply. "I've had a bad feeling about Holt for 6 months," he admitted. "Nobody could ever get proof. Show me everything." Relief flooded through Marcus as he laid out the documents across the nearest desk, the metadata report proving the fabricated file, the real shell vendor withdrawals traced to Holt's brother-in-law, the old whistleblower memo with Renata's name and the correct date, and finally, the donor spreadsheet connecting her anonymously to his own scholarship all those years ago. Voss studied every page in silence, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. "This isn't just fraud," he finally said. "This is attempted obstruction, evidence tampering, and false imprisonment. We need the district attorney's office on this immediately, and we need Ms. Cole out of that holding cell before she signs anything." Word moved fast once Voss got involved. By sunrise, 2 internal affairs investigators arrived to review the case personally. Meanwhile, a local reporter, the same one Holt had tipped off the day before, got wind that something had shifted overnight and began quietly digging deeper, this time asking Holt uncomfortable questions instead of repeating his talking points. Inside the hospital, the story was already changing shape. Yvonne, unable to stay silent any longer, posted a heartfelt message online defending Renata, describing the countless quiet kindnesses she had witnessed over the years, covering co-workers' shifts, buying groceries for struggling families, comforting frightened patients at 3 a.m. The post spread rapidly. Comments flooded in from former patients and co-workers, all saying some version of the same thing. This woman is not a thief. This woman saved us. Public opinion, which 12 hours earlier had condemned Renata based on a grainy arrest video, began swinging hard in the opposite direction. By mid-morning, Sergeant Holt found himself summoned to internal affairs for what he was told would be a routine financial review. His hands were steady as he walked in, but something in his eyes had changed. The confidence of a man used to controlling every narrative was beginning to crack. Back in the holding area, Renata sat exhausted, the deadline for her forced confession just an hour away. She had made peace, in a quiet, resigned way, with the idea that the truth might not save her, that sometimes good people lose anyway, no matter how honest they are. Then the door opened. A young officer stepped inside, holding a folder thick with paper, his eyes glassy with emotion he was fighting hard to control. "Ms. Cole," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "My name is Marcus Whitfield. I don't think you remember me, but I owe you my entire life." Renata blinked up at him, confusion knitting her brow. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Marcus knelt beside her chair, sliding the donor spreadsheet across the table so she could see her own routing information listed beside the words, Wexford Community Future Scholarship Fund. 15 years ago, someone anonymously paid for my tutoring, then my magnet school uniform, then my community college tuition, he said. My mother cried at our kitchen table the day that letter came. I spent years wondering who did that for me. It was you. Renata's hand rose slowly to her mouth. Marcus Whitfield, she whispered. The boy from Fentress Street. I heard you'd. I lost track of you after you moved. You didn't just help me, Miss Cole. You changed the entire direction of my life. And now I have proof that everything they're accusing you of is a lie built to protect the real thief. Within the hour, Internal Affairs formally confronted Sergeant Holt with the financial trail Marcus had assembled. The shell vendor, the metadata proving the fabricated file, the whistleblower memo Renata herself had filed years earlier without ever knowing its significance. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Holt's composure finally shattered. I needed someone the audit wouldn't question, he admitted, his voice hollow with the exhaustion of a man who knew there was no more room to maneuver. She was convenient, quiet. Nobody would fight for her. He was wrong. By early afternoon, the district attorney's office dropped every charge against Renata Cole and issued a public statement acknowledging the fabricated evidence. Sergeant Daniel Holt was arrested on the same charges he tried to pin on her: embezzlement, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice, plus additional counts for falsely imprisoning an innocent woman to protect himself. Outside the precinct, a small crowd had gathered: nurses, former patients, neighbors who had heard the story spread overnight. When Renata walked out through the front doors, free, sunlight hitting her face for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the crowd erupted into applause. Yvonne rushed forward first, tears streaming as she wrapped Renata in a hug. Andre, the security guard, shook his head in disbelief and murmured, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. Renata simply squeezed his hand. You're saying something now. That's what matters. Marcus stood a few steps back, watching the woman who had quietly reshaped his entire future finally receive a fraction of the goodness she had spent her whole life giving to others. Would you have ever told me? He asked quietly, stepping closer once the crowd began to thin. If none of this happened, would I have ever known it was you? Renata smiled, tired but genuine. No, she admitted. Some things aren't meant to be known. They're just meant to be done. Marcus's eyes glistened.